Hi, I'm Josh Jacob, consultant orthopedic surgeon. This is my colleague Mr. Ash Unithan, and as you can see, we are in the operating theatre of the Salubrious BMI Runnymede Hospital. Today we'd like to talk about fractures around the hip. All what you wanted to know about fractures around the hip but were afraid to ask. And this is your time. So, Nanny's broken a hip. What does it involve? This is basically the hip joint, the socket and the femur. The femur looks like a ball. The socket, as the name implies, is a socket. The way you and I have been created is that the socket creates an articulation through which you are allowed to walk, sit, stand and run rapidly. But Granny has broken a hip. Hip fractures involve breaks just at the ball, around the neck and just between distal to the neck or proximal to the neck, which is called the trochanter.
Or below the neck also. This is a fracture. It can occur in any age group, but we are particularly discussing the fracture of elderly fractures around the hip, and by definition a good percentage of them are osteoporotic fractures. Josh, do you want to throw some highlight on osteoporosis here?
Yeah. Just before, I just want to run back. Mr. Unithan said correctly, it involves predominantly the elderly population. Young people are also at risk of hip fractures, especially those who engage in extreme sports, high velocity injuries, coming off the motorbike, tackle on the football field. It is a rare injury.
Like me.
It is a rarer spectrum of injury, but one that we do see at least once every 6 months. But coming back to Mr. Unithan's question about osteoporosis, majority of the people after the age of 50, your bone density goes down. And with the relative lack of sunlight in our country, we are at a higher risk of developing osteoporosis, or what we call as lighter bones or brittle bones. So your grandmother would likely have taken a tumble in her garden or indoors, tripping on the carpet, tripping on her cat, and lo and behold, she breaks her hip. She comes to the hospital and the doctor says bones are lighter, the bones have been osteoporotic. What that involves means that the architecture of the bone is such that the bone is becoming inherently weaker than what she was at the age of 21, and as a result of which lighter trauma, lesser velocity of injury, and the bones snap more easier. She must have been on treatment, but this fracture highlights the fact that she's more vulnerable to develop another hip fracture on the other side, or fracture around the spine or around the wrist, and treatment has to start from the day we fix her hip as well as on forwards as the GP takes over the care of osteoporosis.
That's a very good point. So when you have one fragility fracture or osteoporotic fracture, it is quite important to put the person in the right medication to prevent further fractures. So going back to hip fractures, Mr. Jacob, do you want to enlighten the audience about non-operative management of neck or femur fractures?
Yes. So fractures can be treated either with operation or without an operation. Not treating a fracture with an operation doesn't mean that we are ignoring you. It is because your fracture may be lending itself to without surgery recovery. Now, the people who don't need to have an operation are the ones who perhaps the fracture is not particularly displaced. As we said from this particular model here, the fracture can be just a hairline crack. By the way, you might call a fracture a crack, a break, or a fracture. That's a common term involved.
But the same thing.
It is exactly the same thing, but to you, a crack may mean just a slight break. Now, if it is just a light crack or hairline fracture, maybe we don't need to fix the fracture or replace the bone. And very often they can manage with a bit of perseverance and physiotherapy, they can manage without an operation.
But I have to say that is a bit rare. Majority of the hip fractures, because it's a weight-bearing joint, would involve some sort of a fixation. So coming back to the fixation types, Mr. Jacob, would you want to highlight what kind of operations we do?
I know you're pushing me to answer the fixation, but I just want to highlight one more category of people who don't need an operation, and the ones who are not just the hairline crack, but the ones who are terminally ill. We don't want to force them to have an operation because that will pretty much decide a death sentence upon them. It's likely that you're not watching this video because you're terminally ill and you're perhaps inquiring about Okay, fine.
Yeah, that might be a bit too deep.
All right, okay.
But what did you get to? What was?
So what we would say is, okay,
just
okay,
a second,
forget,
fixation.
just fixation. All right. So coming back to fixation. So in order to fix the fracture, we can either fix the fracture or replace the bone involved around the fracture. Fractures that are closer towards the ball end of the proximal femur, which is this part, tend to be replaced. Why? Because the blood supply is quite precarious, and even if we, with our best attempts to fix it, it's likely to fail. So the literature is quite clear that it's best to replace, and we do that with what is called a hemiarthroplasty, which is available here for you to see, which is essentially a big stem that goes around into the hip bone or the proximal femur, and like for like we're trying to replace the ball, and that is firmly embedded in the femur with cement, which acts as a bone grout, and that gets your grandmother walking straight away.